All right, hey everyone. It's great to have everyone here, and I'm here today with Dale Gentry, who has spent over a decade teaching science such as biology and ecology and other courses at a Christian university, and has recently is transitioning to a position at the Audubon Society, and also runs a nonprofit, Disciple Science, which seeks to help people connect with God through God's creation. So we're thrilled to have Dale with us today, and we're going to chat about his journey from Young Earth Creationism to evolutionary creationism, and then also talk a bit about his passion for the environment. And so why don't we just jump right into it? So Dale, growing up, you assumed that Young Earth Creationism was true. And you changed your mind in university, and I was hoping you could chat a little bit with us about that. So, like, what was the first thing that got you thinking that maybe you might have to adjust your assumptions on evolution? And was that a shock to the system at all?
Yeah, gosh, it's hard to track down exactly what was the first thing, but it was kind of the same old story. It was that university education. I was pursuing a degree in zoology and broadly and in studying wildlife biology and ecology. And that include courses on, sort of the foundations of biology and evolution. And what I came to find was that natural selection is the dominant paradigm in understanding biology, and it made sense to me that I could see that old quote that biology really only makes sense in the light of natural selection. At least in my opinion, that held true, and so I did come to sort of reconsider that. Although I have to admit that it's hard for me to nail down how much of a challenge that was, in part because while I was in college, I was also just not taking my faith as seriously as I was when I was younger. And I don't think it was because of the science as much as it was a loss of community. My youth group and my church had been kind of my whole world when I was younger. That was my social network, and that was where I found meaning in the world. When I went off to college, I looked for churches and I tried to find groups, and I found some, but they just didn't connect with them, didn't really make friends and people that I wanted to hang out with. And so church kind of slowly started to become less prominent. I still was a Christian and still identified as a Christian, but it just wasn't a big issue for me. And so as I started getting more and more comfortable with evolution, it was also siloing science and faith, that they were like two different worlds, two different issues, not overlapping very much. And so it didn't cause a crisis of faith. I was having a crisis of faith for a different reason. I just wasn't taking it very seriously, in part because I realized my faith is really rooted in my community. And when I lost that community, it just became issue number 5 on my mind instead of the first thing that I thought of when I woke up in the morning.
Yeah, so community really is so important, and that's good to highlight that. And on the other hand, siloing science and faith probably didn't help in terms of bringing you back. But eventually, after maybe a number of years, you did return to more vibrant faith. So what was that like, and what was the impetus there?
Yeah, it was almost a decade. It was roughly my whole 20s, which was, finishing college and then graduate school, doing a master's and doing a PhD. Right near the end of my PhD, I had, I hit this period where I realized that the faith, which was so important to me in my youth, it really was the most important thing in my life in middle school and high school, no longer was. And that this new life I had created for myself, which was really designed around making myself happy, pursuing what I thought would give me meaning and purpose in this world, was failing. It was a broken system, and I kind of had this early midlife crisis. And when I turned 30, and I realized that I no longer had a meaningful relationship with Jesus, and it was this pursuit of my own happiness based on my own standards of right and wrong was utterly failing. So I I said, I need to reconnect with Jesus. I need to make my faith meaningful again. And that was the point at which I struggled with the intersection of science and faith. Because at that point, I mean, I spent 10 years becoming a scientist. It was now my career. And I realized, oh, if I'm going to start taking the Bible seriously again, I need to wrestle with these things that I had just put in two separate categories, in two separate worlds, so that they didn't have to conflict. So my early 30s, I spent a number of years trying to put my science and my faith back together again. And it didn't cause a faith crisis, but it caused me to just come to new understandings of what science is and how the Bible works and how God works and the whole thing. So it was a reconstruction, later in life.
Right. And so an early midlife crisis, and it's sometimes wonderful to get that out of the way early, I suppose, rather than, because it can lead to growth. And so, but growth is not always smooth. And so what were some of the challenges in putting your faith back together with science? And was it like, did you struggle with some of the Old Testament passages or what was, what was that like?
Yeah, I mean, I had a number of issues that I needed to wrestle with. And some of it was scripture. I certainly came from this perspective that, a sort of evangelicalism, which has a very high regard for scripture, and that I needed to make the Bible work with my understanding of the world. So I had to figure that out. I also was deeply invested and connected with nature and with conservation biology, which is sort of my career now, and how certain Christians think that was not something that we should be doing, that we shouldn't be concerned with environmental issues. I had to figure out why that is, and is that the way I have to be as a Christian, and really just science in general, that there was this sense, and even the church I was going to during my reconstruction phase in my 30s was not super welcoming of science in the mainstream view. And so I had to figure out why is it that Christians have this tension with science, and is it inherent? Like, is this just part of Christianity that I need to, re-silo again? Or is it something that is a construction that's more recent or not built in? And so as I digging and research, I found that, there's no incompatibility between science and faith. It's something we have manufactured. And so that's where I got really interested in, especially when I started my career at this Christian college, figuring out how to talk to Christians about science in a way that we could see them as mutually compatible, and that they could thrive and even build off each other. I've come to see that science benefit from Christianity, Christianity can benefit from science. That's what I instigated my project Disciple Science out of, helping people to see that it's not that not only can they coexist, they actually can develop strength based on an integration of the two.
Great, wonderful. So let's maybe dig into that a little bit. So let's talk a little bit about Disciple Science, and let's go there. So could you expand a little bit on what you just ended the last little segment with?
Disciple Science is oversimplified as it's sort of a media project. So we're making videos and we're making a podcast and we have a blog. And so we want to make resources that are out there. And the message that we want to communicate is that, and which is sort of embedded in the name. And we're actually thinking about rebranding, because we think the name is, the Disciple Science might be a little bit turn off for scientists, and the science part might be a little bit of a turn off for Christians. So we're thinking we need to come up with a way of reapproaching this. But fundamentally, I think my highest calling is as a disciple of Jesus. I want to follow him and design my life around his teachings. And therefore, I think Christians, disciples of Jesus, need to re-engage with how science works and what it is, and find ways to make those fit together, because so many people, me in my youth, and so many of my students at the university where I taught, have a hard time putting those together. And my big emphasis, I think, is that over the past 100 years especially, we have come to believe that the main interface between science and Christianity should be the reinterpretation of scientific conclusions. That our science should lead us to, say, well, it wasn't evolution, it was God that created life and everything. And maybe, it isn't humans causing climate change, but this is part of God's providence or something like that. And so we are really putting all our eggs into Christianity. It's going to help us better understand science. We're going to reinterpret all of these scientific explanations. I personally find that it just doesn't work.
It's not helpful.
No, not helpful. And it just doesn't, it doesn't make sense. It's not cohesive. It doesn't give us better explanations of the world. It sort of makes what I think the scientific explanations fall apart and lose their explanatory power. So I think that Christians don't really come up with new answers to scientific questions. I think the answers are basically the same. Natural selection is the process. But what Christianity should, our interface with science should be our ability to find teleology and meaning in the natural world. And science can't talk about meaning and purpose in nature. It's just explanation of what it is and how it works. And that we should, it was actually, I found this quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer early in my reconstruction that talked about how that we aren't to find new explanations for God or new explanations for science, that we are to find compatibility with how God is acting through science. And so
is this sort of like seeing the beauty of God and what we know about science, and not just looking for him in places that we don't understand and in mystery?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we've gotten stuck providing alternatives, right? Either natural selection did it, or God did it, or either humans are, responsible for climate change, or God is somehow directing, the climate system through his divine providence or whatever. And I find this either or false dichotomy is not working. And so I find that God is working through scientific mechanisms. But I'm also concerned with the way Christians have sort of divorced ourselves from science and divorced ourselves just from nature, that of course we don't connect with God through nature, because we think that our religion is really just about how to get to heaven and about a personal relationship with Jesus. We think that the earth is going to be sort of put on the eternal trash heap when Jesus comes back or whatever, and we're going to spend eternity in heaven. And that's not part of Christian doctrine either. I found that the doctrine of creation, that creation is a reflection of God, that it is a way of connecting with God, that our interest in nature, our connection with the fascinating and beautiful parts of this world, that is somehow drawing us into relationship with God. It's not just a mere curiosity, that we should find real meaning and purpose in that. And so we want disciple science to do just that, not only sort of reframe our connection with science, but to help Christians connect with the physical world, because we think it will draw us closer to God.
Yeah, great. And does that connect a little bit with, or do you think this is based a little bit on the fact that maybe when you went through your journey, you didn't have the discipleship that maybe you had needed at the time? And are you trying to now provide that out of love to others who are going through similar situations?
Yeah, 100%. I really lacked, unfortunately, a mentor to help me through this process. I had some good mentors professionally in the science world. I had some good mentors, that were talking to me about my faith. But unfortunately, no one that really sort of filled that gap. Fortunately, I was able to kind of figure it out on my own, mostly I just finished my PhD. I knew how to read books and dig into the literature, and I kind of figured it out mostly through books. But I came to be aware, especially through my time teaching at the University of Northwestern, which is a little Christian liberal arts school here in St. Paul, that when students encounter evolution and natural selection, and many of them find it as a compelling explanation of the world, they sometimes go through a bit of a crisis themselves, saying, I thought Christians weren't allowed to have these ideas, that these things don't fit together. And if they aren't maybe comfortable coming and talking to me, or if they're going through that crisis at a secular university, they're going to go to the internet, most likely, right? That they're going to type in something like, can Christians believe in evolution, or something along those lines. And that's what I want Disciple Science to fill that gap, that I hope that they will find our videos and our podcast and our website and see a message, not only that they can, but a vision for how they can. And so if you dig into our videos, you'll find we don't really spend a huge amount of time dissecting the science, because I think there's fantastic resources out there that can teach science to us. And again, I'm not trying to reinterpret the science, but I want to help people see how the science can connect us with God, how the science is compatible with Christian theology and doctrine, and with our understandings of Scripture. And so we spend a lot of time, and that's where I spent my reading focus. Is I wasn't really, I kind of understood the science, but I wanted to figure out how theologians pieced our concepts of God and divine revelation and Scripture and whatnot together with what I understood in science. And that's where I really was encouraged and found beautiful harmony through the writings of Alistair McGrath and N.T. Wright and C.S. Lewis and John Stott and all of these brilliant theologians who were already the pillars of my spiritual journey. When I started to read into their views of science, I found that they also had deep and beautiful insights about how science could fit with my spiritual life, and also correct maybe some of the doctrines that I wasn't quite understanding in my youth, to make it all fit together into a really cohesive, beautiful puzzle.
Yeah, well, so they were your mentors in a way.
They were, yes. Through their writings, they guided me into a new synergy.
Yeah. So you mentioned something a couple minutes ago about when kids have issues, they're going to wind up going to the internet, and we want to fill that gap. And what can churches do to step in? Because it's like we want to get to the kids before they go off and see an R and Ra video, or
right.
Some of the new atheists, or just because the YouTube is filled with a lot of anti-Christian sort of apologetics and whatnot. We want to prep kids for this. So if in churches and youth groups we can be introducing discussions about the environment when kids are 12, 13, 14, 15, that would be helpful.
Yes, 100%. I mean, the short answer is the church can do a lot, right? I mean, the church has so much potential in shaping our understanding of who God is and how God acts, and the world as a revelation of God, and how to better approach Scripture. This is difficult, I think. I mean, I've got young kids. My oldest is 11, and talking to kids about Scripture in the sort of nuanced, understanding that I have as an adult through a historical context, I think is more difficult than just saying, here it is. It's just, read it on face value. It's simple, it's plain. I actually don't think Scripture is simple or plain. I think in some ways our faith is simple and plain. It's put your trust in Jesus, follow Jesus, be willing to admit that your definition of good and evil is the wrong one, and do your best to dedicate your life to Jesus. That's a very simple idea, and that's what you need to be a Christian. But if you're interested in the nuances of the doctrines and theology, it gets very complex, and Scripture gets very complex. And I have sort of given up on telling people, I think Christianity is simple, but theology and Scripture, that's better to just sort of hold on to it lightly, allow there to be a little bit of complexity, almost embrace the complexity. I think that Scripture is just full of metaphor and imagery, some of which is not crystal clear, and that invites us to be that Psalm 1 Christian that just sort of reads it and meditates on it day and night. And in my youth, I kind of thought, I've read it, I know what it says, simple. I'm done with this, and I have come to see that I can find new meaning and new understandings from the same passages of Scripture I've read dozens of times, and I find that just delightful.
it's a lifetime relationship with Scripture, and you can
Yes.
just keep, yeah.
Yep.
No, that's wonderful. So let's see where I want to go next. So we're talking about discipling kids. What are some of the do you have any examples offhand, or if you don't, just a general approach to your experience with discipling your students? Was there any particular pattern that you saw of issues that were common to your students, or an approach that you used with them that was particularly helpful, or just, I don't know, I want to leave this open-ended, but.
No, yeah. No, I think that's an important question. And I don't want to claim to have the final say on the best way to do this,
Yes.
right? So when I was teaching my students, there was one class in particularly that was targeted at biology majors that are kind of early in their career, so freshman, sophomore, where we spent a good portion of the class talking about evolution and natural selection. I think that if I had entered that class and on the first day of class I said, here's my belief system. I think that God used evolution to create everything, and I want to show you that throughout this semester. I think that 2/3 of them would have shut down and ignored me for the rest of the semester, because they had, most of them I know from experience, sort of come in with the conviction that that is wrong and that Christianity is incompatible with evolutionary creation. So what I would do in teaching my classes is saying, I have a belief on this, but I'm not going to tell you what it is now. I'll expand on it later in the semester. But what I want you to do as we go through this topic is listen to other Christians, many of whom might not agree with you on everything, because I want you to, what I would do early on is show them that there are people that they probably hold in high regard, people like Billy Graham, who had buildings named after him on our campus, right? That Billy Graham doesn't take this young earth view. So I said, if you revere Billy Graham's ability to understand Scripture and follow God, then you can't say he's a heretic, right? And he holds these views. So let's learn to listen to people that hold different views, understand why they believe what they believe, and allow yourself to grow from it, so that instead of going into it saying this is the right view and how do I find evidence that supports my view, I want us all to be willing to learn from each other. And I would tell them that, hey, this is a never-ending journey, and if I find new evidence that points me in a new direction, I will change my belief system as well. I'm not here to prove myself right or prove a certain perspective. I'm a genuine search for truth and understanding. So I told them that I wasn't going to try and tell them what to think, but that I wanted to expose them to different ideas and help them understand why Christians disagree on when and how God created. And I found that softened their hearts a little bit, that made them a little bit more willing to listen, that they were going to hear from different perspectives, that all of those perspectives were deemed compatible with Christianity, that our university was comfortable with me teaching all those perspectives, even though some of them thought ahead of time that maybe they weren't in line with evangelical Christianity. And so that's what I endorse, even though I feel pretty strongly that evolutionary creationism is how God made it all fit together. I find that claiming that is my position and convincing people that they need to agree with me is a good way of ending conversations and discussions.
Interesting. So it's almost like, if I'm hearing you right, it's just guiding them on their own journey and encouraging them to walk on a journey and take an exploration is really more effective than trying to tell them this is what you should believe. And
I think so, especially with young people. They're people in their late teens and early 20s. They're kind of inclined to maybe question authority anyhow. They want to figure things out for themselves. For many of them, for the first time in their life. And that's my experience. I know there are other people, even within our department, that sort of took a different perspective and they did advocate for a certain position. But at least for me, that's what I wanted to do. And I found that students appreciated it. The vast majority of them, some of them would say, hey, even if I don't agree with you, I really appreciate your willingness to have the dialogue and to listen to me and to accept, with grace, young earth creationist perspectives, even if you think they're wrong. And so, and it's kind of just my personality too, if I'm honest. I think it does work for people, but I'm just not a very heavy-handed person. And so that's the approach I'm taking with disciple science. I don't want to just sort of, shove a perspective down people's throats. I want to approach it with grace and create a community that values listening to others, even if we disagree with each other.
Right. Okay. So let's so now at the outset of this conversation, I sort of advertised there'd be two sections, but they're sort of all
we fit it all together. That's okay.
Yeah, together. It's fine.
We can wing it. We can wing it.
It's just the way conversations go. So what focusing more on disciple science. So what has been your favorite part of the endeavor so far? What's really been rewarding to you so far?
Well, I mean, what's most rewarding is just getting feedback from people that it's helpful, that it's meaningful, that they've been looking for something like this, and I just really appreciate you putting it together. So that feedback, will set me for a week at a time. Just it feels so good to hear that. But it forces me to be thoughtful about how to talk about these ideas. And personally, I love the challenge of writing. I think I have a lot of room for growth in my skill as a writer, and so I enjoy that. But mostly, I just really get a lot of enjoyment from connect with people like you, getting to meet and talk with people and hear about their views on scripture or science, or how to apply science in a secular world or whatever it may be, and just helping to see sort of a community come together around this idea of taking the God's creation and Christianity, which I think are unfortunately have kind of been separated and divorced for the past 100 years or so, and try and get us back together. Yeah.
Do you think they're separated and divorced because there's a mistrust of scientists? Like, well, scientists are atheists, so we can't believe everything they're telling us. Or there's is there conflict there for that reason?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of actually, I'm working on a video on this very topic right now. I think a lot of that tension comes from our misunderstanding of the difference between science and the words of scientists, right? Now, so science is always going to be performed by scientists, and so you can't really separate them in two different things. But we fail to understand that the understandings of scientists are not necessarily the teachings of science, and that's really on display with people like Richard Dawkins, who is a good scientist, right? But he has some beliefs that science disproves God, because he has a very wooden interpretation of scripture. He has a very interventionist view of God as the creator, meaning he had to do things via miracles. So he is, while he is a scientist, his conclusion that God doesn't exist is not a teaching of science. It is an interpretation. It's metaphysics. It's philosophy.
So he stepped outside his lane in a way.
Completely, yes, right. And I think in reality, it's almost impossible for us to. I think we all just do that, because humans are meaning-making people. So we're all going to be thinking outside of our lane. But what I think we could do a lot in repairing the relationship by making a clear distinction about what is science. And science explains what the world and universe is made of and how it works. And recognize that science can't answer the question about whether God exists or not. It's just not built to do that. It's a value-free enterprise. It's a meaning-free enterprise. It can't answer questions about spiritual beings, about metaphysical properties. At least I feel confident saying that. And so what science does is just explain what the world's made of and how it works. And it's more the realm of philosophy to adjudicate how that applies to God and how it works, and theology, I should say. And that's where it's uncomfortable for scientists to let go of our our, what our society values so much, which is our ability to explain the world. And we've done so very effectively. And so we get a lot of, credit. Hey, yay for the scientific revolution, because we understand how the world works better. And we think that those understandings are limitless, that we will be able to explain everything. And you find that type of language from many scientists, especially in the secular world. But you don't have to look very far into philosophy to find people pushing back on that idea that science is not set up to answer our big worldview questions.
Right. So moving on a little bit to, and this may dovetail into your new position at the Audubon Society, or it may not, but can you just speak a little bit about what you're most passionate about with regards to ecology and the environment, and if you could just, there's maybe a general interest audience watching, and what are a couple key things you want to impress upon people about what your passion is?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so my field of science is ecology, which is understanding the interactions between organisms and their environment. And I'm especially interested sort of in what we call wildlife biology. And so I study birds and mammals and forests and those sorts of things. And I think it is natural that for our emotional responses to be tied to what we know a lot about, right? So as I study zoology, I'm studying birds and mammals, and I start to notice that many of their populations are really struggling, that the birds that I find such delight in going out and looking at, their populations are declining, and their habitats are disappearing, and the climate that sort of holds it all together is changing. I think it's almost impossible for me to not care about that deeply emotionally, and to want to do something to undo some of the negative impacts that I'm witnessing. And so my interest in ecology just leads naturally into a desire to conserve and protect. And I think that is deeply Christian, right? That we are called to look after not only each other, but the world around us, and that's our first assignment on the first page of Scripture. And so I have always been, this term is kind of scary, but an environmentalist, because the environment that I study just is so clearly not thriving, and so my desire is to care for it. And so just recently I accepted a new position with the National Audubon Society, which is a conservation organization focused on birds. And I am an ornithologist and study birds and woodpeckers and songbirds. And I'm really delighted about the opportunity to play a role in shaping the direction of bird conservation in Minnesota and the Upper Mississippi River flyway and this general Great Lakes area. And so, this is sort of a new direction for me. But overall, this is a big push for disciple science. We talk a lot about evolution and Scripture and how those things fit together. But I also think that Christians have lost touch with this deep Christian calling to look after creation, to look after nature. And I think some of that is tied to that divorce from science that we've been sort of witnessing for the past couple hundred years. Christians think that science is not something we should be engaged in, so we don't understand it very well, and therefore it's easy to be skeptical of the findings from science about the declines of populations or a changing climate or whatever it might be. And so it all sort of wraps itself up together. I think if we don't understand science, then it's not totally surprising that we don't get on board with what science is telling us, that some of our actions and behaviors are having very negative consequences on the well-being of the planet. So science does talk a lot about that environmental conservation and the Christian calling towards stewardship and all that's wrapped up in that.
So I've been beginning to learn a little bit more about this lately, and I can tend to be a pessimist sometimes by nature. And I'm wondering, is there hope then for the environment? Because I see we may be actually going through a mass extinction event here. We may be right, and it's tough to see when you're in the middle of it. But if we could pan out, we I'm not an expert here, but
Yeah.
we might be going through a mass extinction event, and,
Yeah.
and humans are taking over the planet. And is there anything we can do? I mean, is it just a matter of setting aside more green protected spaces for animals to thrive? Is just the fossil fuel phenomenon just, I don't know.
Yeah, no, great questions, really important. And this is a really important tension, right? As we talk about environmental issues, sometimes it's hard to find hope, and it's important that people realize that they are serious and that these are problems and that they will cause suffering, of the natural world. Romans 8 talks about the groaning of creation, suffering under our sort of poor management. But at the same time, as we talk about the reality of the downside, that we also do find areas for hope. And so I do find hope mostly in the work that I do. Every day I encounter a new story about someone who is concerned about what's going on and in doing something to address it, right? So while climate change is serious and it's hard to be excited about what's happening, I am encouraged by all the people that are actively working on addressing it, and the vision that's being painted for us about a sort of a pollution, I shouldn't say pollution free, but a carbon neutral society that really is going to be achieved within our lifetimes. And I'm encouraged by that. So now I tend to be a little bit more on the optimistic side, although I can understand people that are maybe wired towards pessimism. We're going to, we're unfortunately going to witness a lot of suffering, both of humans and of creation, but we are going to, I think, make some positive progress along those lines. So I think it's important that we do find hope there. Just a side note, I just for the Disciple Science podcast, last week I got to interview Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, who is a brilliant woman, atmospheric scientist and Christian, who just wrote a book called Saving Us, in which she very clearly talks about climate change as a very serious problem, but lays out a clear view of why there is room for hope and how we can address this. And one of the things that she talks about most explicitly is just our need to talk about it, that we should not sort of say, oh, this is so discouraging, and what are we ever going to do to overcome these challenges, and instead talk to people about why we're concerned and what we're doing. And what we find is that hope doesn't precede action. We don't find hope and then do something. That human psychology, we act first and then we find hope. So if we wait for someone to give us hope and then we will do something, it's almost the opposite way around. When we feel that we have agency and we can do something for the good, it will give us hope. And so I think there are a lot of people that are working so hard to address this issue, and I'm really encouraged by that, even though I know that there will be a lot of suffering in the meantime. And I think we are undergoing what we call the sixth mass extinction. There's very good evidence for that. I'm talk to people about the huge ream of birds just in the United States that have gone extinct in the past 100 years. It's a pretty long list, thanks in large part to Hawaii, which has had just terrible loss of species. And yet I am encouraged by the work of the Audubon Society and the Nature Conservancy and Arosha, Christian organizations interacting with the environment, and the Asable Institute of Environmental Studies, and all these other organizations that I just think are doing such a great job of saying this is a problem, let's do something about it. And we're effectively making progress in that area. So
great. Well, thank you, Dale. Thank you so much for joining us all today. I love this conversation, and God bless you and your organization, and thanks for coming on.
Well, thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you. I appreciate the work you're doing as well. I think we're both concerned with the people that feel this forced to choose between their faith and science, or many of the false dichotomies are out there. I'm glad for your work and helping to provide vision of hope for integration of those two.
Great. Thanks. So have a great day.
Great. Same to you.